Today we're exploring one of the most mysterious and debated chapters in the Old Testament, Ezekiel chapter 38. This powerful prophecy speaks of a great battle involving Gog and Magog, nations from the north and the land of Israel. Whether you're a student of biblical prophecy, someone curious about end times events, or simply interested in understanding this ancient text, this video will break down every detail of Ezekiel 38 in clear, accessible terms. Before we dive into the specifics of chapter 38, let's establish some crucial context. The prophet Ezekiel lived during one of the most turbulent periods in Jewish history, the Babylonian exile, around 593 to 571 BCE. He was among the Jewish captives taken to Babylon when Jerusalem fell to King Nebuchadnezzar. Ezekiel's prophecies are unique in their vivid imagery and symbolic language. His book contains some of the most dramatic visions in all of Scripture, from the famous Valley of Dry Bones to the detailed temple visions at the end of his book. Chapter 38 sits within a larger section of Ezekiel that deals with prophecies against various nations and future restoration promises for Israel. What makes Ezekiel 38 particularly fascinating is its futuristic nature. Unlike many of Ezekiel's prophecies that had immediate or near-term fulfillment, this chapter describes events that most scholars believe are yet to occur. The language is apocalyptic, the scope is global, and the implications are profound. Let's identify the key players in this prophetic drama. The central figure is someone called Gog of the land of Magog. This mysterious leader is described as the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. But who exactly is Gog and where is Magog? Throughout history, biblical scholars have proposed various interpretations. Some suggest Gog represents a specific individual, a future world leader who will emerge from the north. Others view Gog as symbolic, representing forces of evil or opposition to God's people. The land of Magog, along with Meshech and Tubal, are generally identified with regions to the north of Israel. Ancient historical records suggest these names correspond to areas in what we now know as modern-day Turkey, southern Russia, or the broader region around the Black Sea and Caucasus Mountains. But Gog doesn't act alone. The prophecy mentions a coalition of nations that will join this northern leader. These include Persia, modern-day Iran, Cush, which corresponds to parts of modern Sudan and Ethiopia, Put, likely referring to Libya or parts of North Africa, Gomer, possibly parts of Turkey or Eastern Europe, and Beth Togarmah, another reference to regions in modern Turkey or Armenia. This coalition represents a formidable alliance stretching from the far north to the south and east of Israel, essentially surrounding the Promised Land with hostile forces. Now let's walk through the actual prophecy as it unfolds in Ezekiel 38. The chapter begins with God speaking directly to Ezekiel, commanding him to set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog. This phrase, set your face, appears frequently in Ezekiel and indicates the seriousness and certainty of the prophetic message to follow. God declares that he will put hooks in Gog's jaws and bring him forth with his entire army. This vivid imagery suggests that while Gog may think he's acting of his own free will, he's actually being drawn by divine providence into a predetermined scenario. It's a powerful reminder of God's sovereignty over world events, even those involving hostile forces. The prophecy describes this invasion as occurring in the latter years and in the latter days. This timing is crucial because it places these events in an eschatological context, meaning they relate to the end times or final period of world history before God's kingdom is fully established. The target of this invasion is explicitly stated, the land of Israel, but not just any version of Israel. The prophecy describes a specific condition. Israel will be brought back from the sword and gathered from many peoples. This refers to a regathered Israel, a nation that has been restored after a period of dispersion and exile. This detail is remarkable when we consider that Ezekiel wrote these words while Israel was in exile and the land lay desolate. Yet he prophesied of a future time when the Jewish people would return to their ancestral homeland and be living there again. Many see the modern establishment of Israel in 1948 as at least a partial fulfillment of this restoration prophecy. The description of Israel's condition at the time of this invasion is particularly intriguing. The prophecy states that Israel will be dwelling safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. This paints a picture of a peaceful, prosperous, and secure Israel. Some interpret this literally, suggesting that at the time of Gog's invasion, Israel will be living in complete peace, perhaps following a peace treaty or agreement that has resolved regional conflicts. The mention of dwelling without walls could indicate a time when Israel feels so secure that traditional defensive measures are unnecessary. Others interpret this more symbolically, seeing it as a reference to Israel's spiritual condition, dwelling in confidence because of their trust in God rather than in military might or defensive fortifications. The prophecy also describes Israel as a people gathered from the nations who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell in the midst of the land. This suggests material prosperity and successful agricultural and economic development. Again, something that resonates with modern Israel's remarkable transformation from a largely barren land to a thriving, technologically advanced nation. Why does Gog decide to invade Israel? The text provides insight into the invader's motivation. Gog comes to take plunder and to take booty, attracted by Israel's wealth and prosperity. The prophecy describes his thought process. I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. This reveals a predatory mindset. Gog sees Israel as an easy target, prosperous but seemingly defenseless. It's the classic bully mentality. Attack those who appear vulnerable to steal what they have worked to build. The phrase "to take plunder and to take booty" is repeated, emphasizing the materialistic and greedy nature of this invasion. This isn't portrayed as a holy war or ideological conflict, but as a straightforward attempt at conquest and theft on a massive scale. There's also a suggestion of divine irony here. While Gog thinks he's acting on his own initiative to exploit a vulnerable target, God is actually orchestrating these events for his own purposes. The hunter becomes the hunted, and the predator becomes the prey in God's larger plan. The most dramatic part of Ezekiel 38 is God's response to this invasion. Rather than allowing Israel to be overwhelmed by this massive coalition, God himself intervenes directly and decisively. The text describes God's anger being aroused. Surely in that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. This earthquake is so powerful that it affects all living creatures, fish, birds, beasts, and all human beings. Mountains are thrown down, steep places collapse, and every wall falls to the ground. But the earthquake is just the beginning. God declares that he will call for a sword against Gog throughout all his mountains. This appears to reference supernatural intervention that turns the invading coalition against itself. Every man's sword will be against his brother, suggesting that in the chaos and confusion, the different elements of the coalition begin fighting each other instead of their intended target. Then comes divine judgment from above. I will rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. And this language echoes the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, indicating complete and devastating judgment from heaven. The purpose of this dramatic intervention is clearly stated. Thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. This isn't just about defending Israel. It's about God demonstrating his power and sovereignty to the entire world. The defeat of this massive coalition serves as a global testimony to God's reality and supremacy. Throughout history, scholars and theologians have approached Ezekiel 38 from different interpretive angles. Understanding these various approaches helps us appreciate the complexity and richness of this prophetic text. The futurist interpretation sees this prophecy as entirely future, describing literal events that will occur during the end times. Proponents of this view often connect it with other biblical prophecies about the last days, such as those found in Daniel, the Olivet Discourse, and Revelation. They look for modern nations that might correspond to the ancient names mentioned and watch world events for potential alignments. The preterist interpretation suggests that this prophecy was fulfilled in ancient times, perhaps during the conflicts following the Babylonian exile or in the wars involving the Seleucid Empire and other Hellenistic powers. This approach emphasizes the immediate historical context of Ezekiel's time. The preterist interpretation suggests that this prophecy was fulfilled in ancient times, perhaps during the conflicts following the Babylonian exile, or in the wars involving the Seleucid Empire and other Hellenistic powers. This approach emphasizes the immediate historical context of Ezekiel's time. The idealist or symbolic interpretation views the prophecy as representing the ongoing spiritual battle between good and evil, with Gog and Magog symbolizing the forces of darkness that continually oppose God's people throughout history. This approach focuses on timeless spiritual principles rather than specific historical events. The historicist interpretation sees the prophecy as unfolding throughout church history, with various historical events and powers representing different aspects of the Gog and Magog coalition. Many contemporary scholars adopt a dual fulfillment approach, recognizing that biblical prophecies often have both near and far fulfillments, immediate historical applications as well as ultimate eschatological realizations. Regardless of one's interpretive approach, Ezekiel 38 contains timeless truths and principles that remain relevant today. First and foremost is the theme of God's sovereignty over world events. Even when evil seems to be advancing and threatening God's people, the ultimate outcome remains under divine control. The prophecy also emphasizes God's faithfulness to his covenant promises. Despite Israel's history of unfaithfulness and the judgment of exile, God's commitment to his people endures. He will defend them when they are genuinely threatened and will fulfill his promises of restoration and blessing. There's also a powerful message about the futility of opposing God's purposes. No matter how formidable the coalition against God's people appears, no matter how overwhelming the odds, victory belongs to the Lord. This provides tremendous comfort and encouragement to believers facing persecution or seemingly impossible circumstances. The global scope of God's revelation is another key theme. Through these dramatic events, God makes himself known in the eyes of many nations. This speaks to God's heart for all peoples and his desire that his name be glorified throughout the earth. For modern readers, whether or not they see these events as future literal occurrences, the prophecy serves as a reminder that God is actively involved in world history and that his purposes will ultimately prevail. Ezekiel 38 doesn't exist in isolation, but connects with numerous other biblical prophecies and themes. The mention of Gog and Magog appears again in Revelation 20, where they represent the nations that Satan gathers for a final rebellion after the millennium. This connection has led many to see Ezekiel 38 as describing events related to the end-time scenario outlined in Revelation. The theme of nations gathering against Israel appears throughout biblical prophecy. Psalm 2 describes nations raging and peoples plotting against the Lord and his anointed. Zechariah 12 and 14 speak of all nations gathering against Jerusalem in the last days. Joel 3 describes God gathering all nations for judgment in the valley of Jehoshaphat. These parallel prophecies suggest a consistent biblical theme. There will be a final confrontation between the forces of this world and God's kingdom, with Jerusalem and Israel playing a central role in these end-time events. The supernatural intervention described in Ezekiel 38 also echoes other biblical accounts of divine warfare. From the defeat of Pharaoh's army at the Red Sea to the destruction of Sennacherib's forces outside Jerusalem, these precedents give credibility to the idea that God will again intervene dramatically to defend his people. The theological implications of Ezekiel 38 are profound and far-reaching. At its core, this prophecy affirms several fundamental biblical doctrines. First is the doctrine of divine sovereignty. God is not merely observing world events from a distance, but is actively orchestrating them according to his purposes. Even the hostile actions of enemy nations serve his ultimate plan. Second is the doctrine of covenant faithfulness. Despite Israel's checkered history and periods of unfaithfulness, God remains committed to his covenant promises. This speaks to the unchanging nature of God's character and the reliability of his word. Third is the doctrine of divine justice. The judgment that falls upon Gog and his coalition demonstrates that God will not allow evil to triumph indefinitely. There is ultimate accountability for actions, especially those that oppose God's people and purposes. Fourth is the doctrine of divine revelation. God reveals himself through historical events, not just through words. The defeat of this coalition serves as a global testimony to God's reality and power, fulfilling his desire to be known among all nations. Finally, there's the doctrine of divine protection. While God's people may face threats and challenges, they can trust in his ultimate protection and deliverance. This doesn't mean believers won't face difficulties, but it does mean that God's purposes for his people will ultimately prevail. How should believers today respond to a prophecy like Ezekiel 38? First, it should increase our confidence in God's sovereignty and control over world events. When we see troubling developments in international relations or threats to God's people, we can remember that God is ultimately in control and his purposes will prevail. Second, it should motivate us to pray for Israel and the Jewish people. Regardless of political complexities in the modern Middle East, believers have a biblical mandate to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and the welfare of the Jewish people. Third, it should encourage us to live with eternal perspective. If these events are indeed future, they remind us that this present world order is temporary and that God's kingdom will ultimately be established on earth. Fourth, it should inspire us to share the gospel with urgency. If we're living in the latter days, then time is short for people to respond to God's offer of salvation through Jesus Christ. Finally, it should comfort us in times of persecution or difficulty. Just as God promises to defend Israel against overwhelming odds, he promises to be with his people through every trial and challenge they face. Ezekiel 38 remains one of the most fascinating and debated chapters in biblical prophecy. Whether we see it as describing ancient events, future occurrences, or timeless spiritual principles, its message is clear. God is sovereign, his people are under his protection, and his purposes will ultimately triumph. As we study prophecies like this, we're reminded that our God is not only the God of the past and present, but also the God of the future. He knows the end from the beginning, and nothing catches him by surprise. Thank you for watching to the end of this video. If this video has been helpful, please like and subscribe for more biblical content. Share your thoughts and questions in the comments below. We love engaging with our viewers about these important biblical topics.